Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another one of these live stream virtual tours with myself, Sam Gregory, and I'm very happy to welcome this evening's guest, Verity Milligan. Verity, how are you?
Well, I'm good. I'm good. Yeah. Other than my boiler breaking today, everything is golden. But how are you?
I'm very good. I have full capacity on the boiler. You'll be pleased to
You
hear.
have hot water? I'm so envious. Ah,
I know, I'm sorry. Full capacity on the boiler. Everything is going beautifully. This is famous last words before the tech completely breaks tonight. Um, but welcome everyone. If you're joining us, as usual, it's really cool for us to see where you are. So do drop us a little comment in the box telling us whereabouts you are based, and give the post a little like as well. That's always much appreciated. Now, as there, thumbs up. As ever, this evening we'll be going through some images from a particular location with one of our fantastic Light and Land tutors. And what we're actually going to do this evening, in the last couple of tour events, we've had quite a lot of images and we've covered quite a lot of locations. We're going to just sort of scale that back tonight and really dig a little bit deeper into the images, the construction of them, thoughts around composition, lighting, color, all sorts of things. So we've actually got a smaller number of images, but that we're going to get into in a little bit more detail. And as ever, if you do have any questions, please do drop those in the comments box and I will pick up on those as we go along. And I do have a little bit of ramble here at the beginning, just as we let people join in. So forgive me that. Before we get into Verity and going around the Glamorgan Coast in Wales, I want to give you a little heads up on what's coming next. We normally do this at the end, and I will do it at the end again, but I just wanted to hit you with a few things because we've got a couple of new bits coming. So first up, next week, we're going to the Lake District with Adam Karnatz, and that's going to be a usual virtual tour with Adam showing us some of his Lake District images. The week after, we're going to introduce something new based on the feedback we got when we did some editing, and I'm going to be doing this, and it's going to be called Pixel to Print, and I'm going to be taking you from a raw file and considerations about composition a little bit through the processing and to an actual live print. What could possibly go wrong during the live stream? And I'm going to condense that into about 30 minutes. That is certainly the plan. And then the week after that, we have Astrid McGeechan coming back to do Bruges and York with us. So that's what's coming up next. Basically, stay tuned. We're going to be developing more and more of these. Tuesday night, 8 p.m. You need to have that in your diary. Now, that's the admin taken care of. And welcome to everyone who's joining. We've got Dorchester, Northumberland, London, Bournemouth Red Arrows Association. That's fantastic. If we could arrange a flyby for my print session, that'd be awesome. East Sussex, west of Canada, a couple up there in Scotland as well. So let's get into it. I shall stop my rambling and we'll get to some of Verity's fantastic images around the Glamorgan Coast. And actually, before we do, Verity, if I can throw to you, can you tell us a little bit more about why you chose to do a tour in this location?
okay, so it's not just the Glamorgan Coast, it's also the Gower as well. So it sort of takes in that South Welsh coastline. And my in-laws, who are both Methodist ministers, they have basically they minister in Barry, and they picked up this ministry probably about 6 years ago, and that was my first sort of experience of going down to that part of Wales 6-7 years ago. My mum's from Snowdonia, so I know North Wales really well, and yeah, I think being naturally curious, the minute we sort of went down to visit them, I was off in the car along the coastline to see what I could see, obviously up to the Brecon Beacons as well. And yeah, this part, I feel like this part of the coastline has got so much to offer. And gradually I've kind of headed west, as it were. So started off with the stuff that's nearest to Barry and that part, and then headed out more to the Gower, places like that we'll talk about later, like Rosilly and Three Cliffs Bay and places like that. So there's lots of little places dotted along that coastline. And I think, yeah, I've really enjoyed exploring it, and I've really enjoyed the experience of, I mean, it's perhaps not the most, when you think of Wales, it's perhaps not some of the places that you think of naturally first off. So I think it's got quite a lot of potential, but it's still not secret, but slightly more hidden than perhaps other parts of Wales. And for me, that has a bit of a pull, somewhere that's maybe not overdone, somewhere that I can really get my teeth into and really explore.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, I think definitely there's room for that, and we're going to see a little bit of that as we go through the images. I have just given you all a little bit of a red coastline there, so you can see where we are. So it's tucked away down in that south and southwest part of Wales, and it does feel, as you kind of mentioned, a little bit away from the rest of, certainly England, but it feels a little bit remote, and you've got nice big skies, big beaches, and we're going to get into a bit of that as well. And is that also part of what appeals, that kind of large scale, feeling?
Yeah, I mean, there's some really interesting geology in that part of the world, and when we see some of the images, you'll see that. But yeah, there's kind of big open skies, wide beaches, lots of potential, not just for sort of the big open wide angle shots, but also for smaller vignettes or using telephoto lenses to sort of zoom in on various different things. And I've spent a lot of time on the coast down by like Weston-super-Mare and Breen and Burnham on Sea. So I think it's been really nice to kind of see how different Southwest Wales is in comparison to Southwest England, which is quite muddy at places in terms of their beaches, whereas like Freecliff Bay and places like that, really sandy beaches and places that you can walk out to without losing a boot most of the time.
Best to get your boots where at all possible. And let's get into it, because we've got 7 images, and we're going to, like we said, we're going to kind of deconstruct them a little. And as ever, we really do encourage, if you have any questions, just pop them in the comments. Technical questions, philosophical, photographic questions, location questions, boot related questions. We will try and do it all. Now, I'm just keeping my eye on the comments, and I'm trying to refresh those as we go. But Verity, as you take a little sip, I'll cover for you here. Tell us the time of day. I think I know, but let's tell the time of day here, and then we'll get into the actual image itself.
This is the end of the day, so this is sunset. This is probably the earliest image in the set, so it's shot on a Fujifilm X-T1, if I remember correctly, before I smashed that by accident. No, I didn't smash that one. I smashed the X Pro one. I have a terrible history with cameras and filters. Yeah, so I think it was with the 10 to 22 mil wide angle. And so this is probably from 6-7 years ago. And it's weirdly not conditions that I would necessarily shoot in now. And I think a lot of the time, so I did this actually last week, sort of looking outside and thinking, the sky is clear. There's no interest. I don't want to go out. I don't want to go to the beach and have the sky be clear. But it's interesting when I look back on some of these images, when I hesitate to say I was more enthusiastic back then. Maybe I just knew less. So it was more like, I'm going to go out and just see what happens, rather than sort of having one eye on the conditions, thinking, are these going to be optimal? And actually this one really paid off, because it was low tide and it left quite a lot of the seawater behind. So there was some reflections that I could pull out, and you've got some of this nice seaweed in the foreground as well. And because of the geology of this place, and they call the rock in the background the Welsh Sphinx, because it looks a little bit Egyptian, and like it could have been sort of taken from the desert somewhere and plonked in the middle of Wales, especially when you've got this really warm light that's residing on it. And even with the clear sky, I think there's something about the way the light was working. It was nice and low in the sky that, yeah, it jumped out of me, this composition, especially with the sort of seaweed in the foreground as well, just to add something else. And I took quite a lot of photos further up, so I just had the reflection, but they almost lacked something. There was nothing leading you into the image. So I pulled back a bit, and like I said, this is probably quite early on in my photographic adventure. So I imagine I will do 100 different things differently now, but there's still something about this image that I really like, from the light to the foreground, to the Nash Point and the geology of the place itself.
Yeah, and I think just I'm going to pick up on a couple of actual bits within the image, but just for those viewing along live, I've put the little first poll up. It's certain devices you'll be able to see the poll, and just asking if people have been to this part of Wales. So 58% have not been to this part of Wales, 42% of you have. So there we go, a little bit of background. It's always good for us to know how many of you might have already been there. If I can pick up on just the colour, Verity, because we've talked about this a little bit before, so I don't necessarily want to go over that. Not that I'm suggesting everyone listens to absolutely everything we do together. But I think probably earlier on, photographically earlier on, you were probably seeking and embracing richer colours, and you know, so both, I mean, in the field and then potentially in the processing as well. So obviously this was a fairly rich light because of that time of day, but have you done a little bit more after the fact to really accentuate that?
Yeah, I think colour was definitely my thing, especially early on. I mean, it still is, but that kind of, yeah, I think, I know we've spoken about this before, and again, I don't want to go over old ground as well, but that kind of trajectory you go on with your own creativity, I suppose very early on that curve. And I've been back to this place dozens of times since, but it's oddly, I've never quite got the same quality of lights, which is just the joy of photography anyway, that you can go to a place again and again and again, and each time something is going to be different, or something is not going to be quite the way it was before. And I think part of that's the reason why I keep returning to places. It's not just a one-time thing for me. I want to sort of experience places in different light and different tone. But yeah, I've probably, if I took this photo today and if I edited it today, I would have possibly pulled back those colours a bit, especially in the sky. Maybe that sort of takes over slightly. I'm not here to critique all of my own images. I'm the worst. I mean, if I have an image that I like, then that probably lasts for about 5 minutes. I'm like, yeah, I'm good with this. I'm going to post this. And then after 5 minutes, I'm like, oh, I could have done better.
What have I done?
But maybe that's just being creative, I imagine. So yeah, I think it was a warm evening for sure, but I will have gone into that and extenuated that in Lightroom to bring out some of those tones for sure.
Yeah, but I think it's interesting you mentioned warm, physically maybe warm as well, and sometimes you want to reflect that in the image. I'm going to do a little bit of drawing, everyone, and I will get rid of it properly this time. I wanted to just actually say that you mentioned the seaweed, and really all these lines for me just help us in, you know, and bring us to our Welsh Sphinx at the top there. So, I mean, from the point of view of composition and maybe focal length of the lens that you're using, you know, you're keen to use that foreground here. And it's obviously, I know situations change depending on the thing in front of you, but, you know, are you looking for shapes in that foreground that really help, you know, dominate and bring people in diagonally or straight on or whatever it might be?
Yeah, and I think when I took this image, it may have been instinctual rather than a decision that I made. Now I'm much more conscious of what I'm putting in the foreground. But especially during this image, I think I moved around a lot as the sun went down, and I found something that just worked from that point of view. Like I said, when I tried to just get the reflections, and I mean, I have a love affair with reflections to a certain extent, but they, you know, they are kind of cut across the middle. It does lose perhaps some of the emphasis on foreground that can push the viewer into what you want them to be looking at, or perhaps naturally where the eye would lead. So I think a lot of this might have been slightly unintentional at the time, but I was going through that process of sort of learning about how to compose images, and I imagine the sort of 45 images I took before this just didn't quite work. And I think that's part of the sort of process, and it's part of a workshop process as well, is getting into that sort of state of mind of thinking, okay, what can I get from this, instead of sort of thinking of the whole image, thinking, okay, what's in front of me and what can I use? to really make this the most pleasing image to the eye that I can make it.
Yeah. Okay, cool. I'm going to probably just move us on to the next image, and we've got a good sort of 5-10 minutes on each one here, so that we can get into it a little bit more. And again, if you do have any questions, I'll try and pick those up as we go. And I like the fact now we've just got a slightly different change of feel and tone, and obviously weather is something that we all kind of look out for, and wind, and how we can play with that and how we can use it. So just talk us through a little bit of your thought processes here and shooting the image and composing it as you have done.
So this is one of those times when I arrived really late into the day, and it's interesting, quite a lot, I think, by virtue of the time that I've been there, the times of the day and the times of the year, quite a lot of these are sort of towards the end of the day. And I arrived late. I think this was the day I drove down, and didn't want to miss out on just that wonderful kind of civil twilight that you get after sunset. And it's funny, if I think about the other image where I would have gone home, and all I had really cared about at that point was the light and how it reflected onto things and how it extenuated things. And then I think about this image, which is much, I guess, a lot more subtle in terms of what's going on. I think previously I probably was just not really bothered with that kind of blue hour. But I think, obviously I do quite a lot of city stuff. And I think for me, blue hour stuff there has really turned me on to doing blue hour stuff in the landscape. So yeah, it was a bit of a clamber down. The clamber down to bays in South Wales is the fun part. The clamber back up, not so much. Not so much fun. I think I went up and down about 2 times as well, because the sky kept changing and it kept doing different things. And it's one of those lessons on don't leave too quickly, give it time to play out, and the sky might do something interesting. And it's funny, I've never shared this image. So this is the first time I've actually shared it. It's one of the, I have so many images that sit in my Lightroom. Just, they're sort of 4-starred, and I want to come back to them at some point. And yeah, and when I do, it's a bit like, okay, yeah, I can have a play around with this. But that low tide, you can see the wet on the sand. It's got some of the waves in the sand, some leading lines coming in. And I've used just a little stopper, just a 6-stop, just to bring out some of the clouds, to give it that kind of impression of movement, of stuff happening. It wasn't hugely windy that evening, so that didn't make that effect too overwhelming. And I rather liked how it was just almost pluming out of the top of the rock. And previously I was talking about reflections and how they can cut an image in the middle. And this is one of those where I was like, yeah, I'm okay with that. I'm okay with sort of breaking that rule and having the interest in the middle of the photo, really. It's not, but for me, I think some of the foreground of the sand and the wet sand and coming in, and the background with the long exposure kind of all ties it together.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm going to pop a little poll up just to do with the long exposures, because obviously it's something that we all try and master. And I think it's not necessarily about long or short, it's just about mastering your ability to use the correct time to fit your aesthetic desire, let's say. And so the question there is just to everybody, are you comfortable using filters for long exposures? Do you really understand those inside and out? So I'd just be interested to get answers on that for the poll. If I can, I'm going to do a bit of drawing again. This is like, a kid who's discovered a toy and they're just going to hammer it now forever. But
I'm really sad I don't have this toy.
I've not had it before, so I'm just like, yeah. I really like, you've obviously talked about the mirroring, but just these diagonal lines just really work very nicely as you've talked about. And all of this, spouting out as you've said, and there's lots of repetition of these lines, whether you see them, and there's other little diagonals going on down here. But is it a case, obviously you've got to be aware of what's happening with the wind, to be conscious of the fact that the clouds are coming back at you. And then is it just a case of experimenting with the shutter speed to get it to the look that you desire?
I mean, there are apps and there are ways of defining the time that you would need to get a sort of optimal exposure. But I think because I'm quite intuitive in what I'm doing, I prefer to experiment. And of course, the light's changing all the time, so it can be quite hard to keep up with if without any filters on it saying, oh, it's 1/50th of a second, and then you match that up and you put your filters on and you set your bulb for that, or you just set your whatever time you want for that, and then the light's changed already. So I kind of just enjoy experimenting. And again, it's one of those things that the more you use stuff, the more you get a feel for it. And when you go into a similar situation, you have more of an understanding about how to get the effect that you want. Now, long exposures, obviously, they can be really interesting because you're conveying movement in a single image. But yeah, I think if you're doing like super, super long exposures, now this is only probably about 20 to 25 seconds, if that. So if you're doing super long exposure, where it's 7 minutes, you want to be a bit more on point with making sure that you've got all of your settings correct. But ones where it's, a short amount of time like this, you can afford to experiment. And that's kind of the joy as well. It's kind of the joy of, this was a new place for me and I was completely on my own, which is one of the things about landscape photography as well. When you have this vast landscape and there's very few people there. Siri thinks I'm talking to it. It did that in a gig the other day, not the other day, before COVID, which was the other day really, because time has become inconsequential. So I think for me, I enjoy the experimental part of it, that I can be more precise. But when you've got a scene like this in front of you and you've got this vastness, then part of it is being in that moment as well, which I just really enjoy, especially at this part of the coastline.
And also, if we can, final point. I love the fact they're really coming at us, and that really is what sets it off. If the sky was going left to right, we'd have a different situation going on. And a little comment from Lorraine: looks like a volcano bellowing with smoke.
So that's what it reminded me of. About 10 years ago, I went to Hawaii in the Big Island, and obviously they've got a lot of volcanic activity there. And I was really early on in using a camera, and the photos I've got of that volcano are just, they're depressing when I think about if I could have a chance to go now. It's funny how, it's just 10 years too early. But yeah, no, I think maybe that sort of resonated when I was editing, and I wanted to sort of bring that out, that kind of plume.
And just final thing on this image, and can I just say can I ask about the leaving it fairly dark because that's of the mood? I mean, was that, sometimes we can get a little bit carried away with feeling we have all this data within a histogram and we can spread everything left and right, but there was obviously a conscious decision to keep it on the fairly moody end from a light point of view. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, well, I wanted to keep that kind of end of the day feel. I could have brightened up the rock, and I could have perhaps brightened up the sky more, but I had to play around with it, and it just ended up making it look a bit anemic. And I think I kind of enjoyed the moodiness and the mood that conveyed, because it's, the light is failing, the light is going, and it is very much the end of the day. And I just wanted to convey that kind of something ending, something a bit more broody than perhaps the other image, which is warm and toned and perhaps a bit more in your face, as it were. But I think this is, of course, they're about 7 years apart, those two images. So I think you can probably just see, again, that kind of change in understanding of what I'm shooting. Or, every image is different and every scene is different, but conveying a certain kind of mood.
Yeah. A quick question from Diane, just asking where each shot is taken. So sorry, Diane, if we haven't said that. So this is at Oxwich Bay, is it? Oxwich Bay?
Yes, yeah. So you can, when the tide is out, walk all the way around to Freetless Bay and Popples Bay and different bays. So it kind of all connects up on that Gower region of all of the different bays there that are all worth exploring.
Yeah, keep your eye on the tides. Yeah. Okay, so we're going to move on, and again, a nice little shift in feel and mood and weather and everything. So tell us a little bit about where this is, and this may be the kind of, this area may be the beach people might have seen in different ways, and there's stuff on this beach, etc. But tell us where we are, Verity, and obviously this crazy light.
Yes, this is Rosilly Bay, and this is what happens when you turn up late to the weather event. And I'm at the top thinking, yeah, there's a rainbow, and yes, they're cliched, but I love rainbows, and they really do add something to an image. So I'm sort of scrambling to get myself in a place where I can capture something compositionally that conveys the rainbow, but isn't just the rainbow, which I think is really sort of a trap. I think weather cliches like that, you can fall into a trap of thinking that the weather is the photo, not and then the conditions of the photo, but not the composition, and trying to find a middle path between the two of them, between the conditions that you're photographing in and bringing some sort of interesting composition to it, can be really tricky, especially when you're on the hop and it's happening directly in front of you. So again, this is an image I haven't shared before, and it's an image that when I got back, I was really excited about them, but it was difficult to pull anything out of. And there was probably 10, 11 images I took, but the only one that really worked is when we get the kind of S curve coming through that somewhat mirrors the rainbow coming through the center of the image. I didn't have time to do anything long exposure wise, didn't have any time to get down to the beach before the rainbow disappeared. So sometimes you just have to work with what you got and try and pull something out of it.
Yeah, I think a great point about being lulled into the weather or the light being the shot, that maybe needs to be the motivator for the shot, but everything, the building blocks still need to be there, as you said. And I'm interested about the curves, if I can just, and again, this might be a very subconscious thing, and it's difficult when we kind of pick stuff apart after the fact, because sometimes these things you just sort of feel as you're there. But this, just even allowing this little bit, just to round off a little bit here, so important from my point of view, just to stop it all just slamming into the bottom of the frame. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think I've cropped it that way. I think it's a 10:8 looking at it.
Yeah, it looks it.
And I will have played around thinking, right, what works best in terms of how everything fits together in the frame. And I've got quite a lot of landscape versions of this, but there's just too much off to the side. You just lose yourself in the image. The rainbow doesn't go all the way across, so there was nothing much I could do in terms of making the rest of the image interesting. So the portrait ones were really ones that ended up being much more stand out from that day. And a couple that I've taken first off, the curve at the top, where you've got a bit of the cliffs in, that kind of got cut off. So you lost that curve. And when instinctively, I think the human eye knows what looks good. They might not know why, but yeah, so for me, that having that the vague S curve, as it were, through there was important for the composition of the image.
Yeah, absolutely. And this little bit around here has to be allowed to live, doesn't it? And I think you're right. Our eyes just would really, it wouldn't necessarily quite know why, but we'd feel pinched there and we would trip up on it mentally without even necessarily knowing it. So that's something, I suppose, like you say, ideally you're looking at a lot of that at the time, but when it's all going bonkers in front of you, maybe then just considering your crop after the fact, and just be border patrol, we call it, don't we? Just keeping your eye on those edges.
I think it's a trade-off, isn't it? And this was shot handheld as well, because kind of rushing from the car park to try and make sure I capture something. So yeah, I think sometimes you just, the joy of having modern cameras as well, I guess, is that you've got the luxury of sometimes cropping in, depending on how far into the image your composition lies.
Down on this beach is a big open beach as well, isn't it? So do you actually manage to get down there at all and spend a bit of time on the beach?
Yeah, and this was a windy day as well, which was great. So you can vaguely see it. There's a little shipwreck in the middle of the beach there, which is also good for long exposures. But the weather kind of closed in that day, and sometimes I really enjoy shooting in kind of interesting wet conditions, but when you're getting soaked and the camera's getting soaked, it's sort of a bit of a trade-off about where you go and shoot. So sort of moved away. I think we moved back up the coast to get away from the rain. But yeah, it's another one, like all of these bays include a kind of really nice wander down and then a bit of a hard walk back up. So it's like the reverse of kind of what you want it to be. But
you're working up full of joy though with the images that you've taken. That's the trick,
absolutely,
Verity.
yeah. No, and I mean, any kind of walk up a hill makes you feel good at the top.
Yeah. Okay, well, good. I'm glad we got something from Rosilli, because it's a really gorgeous location, and it is deceptively big, that beach. That is a heck of a long walk down the far end, but there's lots to play with. All those cool patterns, even from above, is cool. So I'm going to move us just for time reasons, Verity, but we wanted to get to Three Cliffs Bay, and maybe I'll let you explain a little bit kind of the layout there, because again, it's quite another ropes, stretching sort of thing, isn't it? So give us a little bit of background there, and obviously, and then we'll get into this shot as well.
Yeah, I think there's lots of different photography locations in this part of the world, but this stands out as an iconic location. And obviously you've got these three cliffs here, which it gets its name from. And there's many different ways you can photograph it as well. So there's the cliffs at the top where you can look over and shoot the vista. I've spent the majority of my time down on the beach. And so geography-wise, there's Pobbles Bay, and then you can walk around to Oxbridge Bay, so all the different bays when the tide is out and staying out. Yeah, and it's got this real vastness to it again. With this image in particular, I wanted to kind of, the tide was going out, which was to my advantage, and I wanted to, and this was in January as well, so you get quite nice short days. So you can start sort of 7:30 and finish about 4:30, which in the summer, forget it, it's just never going to happen. And because the tide was going out, it was leaving water and the ability to reflect the cliffs back in the outgoing tide. And I'd done a lot sort of shooting the other way or round the corner a bit and there's a couple of images later on which depict that. But yeah, I really wanted to capture the reflection here, and because it was, again, just a nice windy day and the clouds were moving towards me, rather than if I had my back to the cliffs themselves, they were sort of moving overhead, which of course is fine, but it sort of, yeah, it just worked a lot better if I was shooting towards the cliffs, and the light, that sort of late evening light, was reflecting back onto them. So I had to get really low to the ground for this. So I'm not really bothered about getting sand everywhere. Like, some sacrifices are worth it when you've got to try and get as low to the ground as possible. Your tripod might get a bit sandy, get a bit dirty.
Well, if it's not dirty and your bum isn't dirty and your trousers aren't dirty, you've not tried hard enough. That's the general rule, isn't it? So, I mean, this, having the sea behind you is a great way to approach it slightly differently as well. The temptation is to presumably go down the beach and kind of look at it side on, but this looking back at the land gives us a different perspective. But it's fairly flat there. So, I mean, you've always got to keep an eye on what's happening behind you, presumably.
Yeah, well, the tide was going out, thankfully. So, yeah, you don't want it sort of an accidental, obviously, as it goes in, it comes in and goes out and lulls. But yeah, I think anything like this, if you're ever near the sea, you need to have one eye on it. It's just so unpredictable at times. So yeah, I think safety first.
Safety first.
But that's why it's good having a workshop leader who's got eyes on everyone. Yeah. So I think, yeah, I'm not that far out. I think the wide angle gives the impression that I'm a lot further out than I actually am. But I think it's just because the perspective is a little bit forced because I'm low down.
So can we talk about that a little bit, using the wide angle and shooting quite low and that perspective thing? I mean, do you find you use wide angles a fair amount? I mean, I know situations vary, but in these coastal sort of locations,
I think they lend themselves to that because there's a real sense of space, and it's not. I mean, a wide angle is not the only lens you can convey that with. I think from a personal perspective, I end up drawn to that, and there'd be times when I use a telephoto, depending on what I'm shooting. But I think, yeah, especially with these big skies, and if I'm going to capture something, some sense of movement, if I'm going to capture a long exposure, I want that sky in the image. So I'm using something round about sort of the 16 to 21 mil range, just to, give that sense of space, give that sense of place as well, and bring the most out of the location. But wide angles aren't easy to use. They aren't the easiest lens to master, and it does take, it takes mistakes and it takes playing around. And often what I use now is my phone as well, just to kind of get a perspective on what I'm composing. So instead of moving a laborious tripod around, I'll kind of use my phone to scout what kind of composition I want before I end up readjusting to that with the big camera. I think phones are really useful for that because they're so easy to wield.
yeah, yeah, especially if you're somewhere where it's a bit more of a faff to get the gear out on the beach, sand, wind, water. It's good to know why you're getting it out before you get it out. I just wanted to talk very briefly before we move on this one about the light on those rocks, and that gritty texture, contrasted with the moving sky and the softness, but still that sense of movement we get there. So this is a few seconds, presumably, on the exposure.
Yeah, I think this is a little stopper again, which is one of my favorite filters. So the 6-stop. I think 10 stops, they can sometimes just be a bit harder to use, a bit harder to master. And at different ends of the day, using the 6-stop, I find just much more manageable. Sometimes I just use like a 2-stop as well, just to give some sort of impression of movement, especially if I'm doing some stuff where the tide is coming in and I want to give the impression of the sort of tide coming around a rock, so you've got some movement in the water. But yeah, because it was nice and windy, you don't need a huge amount of exposure. So again, I'm thinking 20-25 seconds, just enough to get those clouds moving towards us in the image, really. And of course I've sort of classically gone rule of thirds here in terms of where the rocks are and a line in the middle, so I can give some of the reflections. So I've sort of kept to the rule slightly and then broken it in other ways. I think that's what photography is all about.
Yeah, definitely. And anyone who knows me knows I love a triangle, and we're loving our triangles here. And we've got all these going, all these reflections, and actually there's a huge long one. Look, see, I've got my pen. I'm not afraid to use it. Right there as well. So
like an upside down crocodile. It's great.
it is, yeah. I'm a happy boy. We've got that many triangles. So, okay, I'm going to keep us moving, but that gives people a great idea of the drama of this coastline, and that texture on the rock is beautiful, and just finding that with the right light.
The weather is always changing as well, and I think that's the joy of it. There's so much going on that from one minute to the next, you're kind of spoiled for choice about what you can shoot and how you can shoot it.
Yeah. And I love the general toning of this. We didn't get into that, but maybe that's for another day, with all these tans and browns. But we're still in Three Cliffs Bay area, which obviously is a large expanse from the looks of it. So tell us a little bit about this particular shot and this particular part of the beach, Verity.
Yeah, so this is round, so further back towards, so away from the shoreline. So obviously when the tide goes out, you've got these nice pools of water, which can be really useful for reflections. This wasn't an easy image to kind of get the best out of. Sometimes you find that with images, like one part of it works well and then the other part doesn't work as well, and you're sort of trying to match it all up. But of course, I've lost the light at this point, so I'm kind of working with the color in the sky. And something about this part of the coastline that brings out the long exposure in me. Like, I just want to, especially if it's windy, I just think like it's an opportunity to really, it might be slightly overdone in landscape photography, and I kind of appreciate that, but there's something satisfying about conveying movement in a single image. Having that reflection. I'm using a circular polarizer here to kind of bring out some of the reflections in the pools as the tide has gone out. I don't always use a circular polarizer because they can be unwieldy, especially if you've got clear skies. They can mess up your exposure, but they can be very useful from this point of view. And you can see you've got the sort of triangle there again, just a little bit of that coming in from the rock, so some interest on that side of the image, and then some of the nice color on this side of the image. They're quite contrasty in a way, the dark rock and all of that kind of texture with the colors of sunset, and cut through the middle by this tidal puddle.
Tidal puddle, Verity. I think you're doing it a disservice there, my friend. I think these sorts of little pools can be very appealing, can't they, to play with? And I suppose the challenge, which I think you've done successfully here, is finding a way to introduce them. It goes back to what you said earlier about the weather can't just be the shot, and you can't just find a nice pool and think, oh well, that's going to do it. How do you find ways to make these work, I suppose, is the question. And I suppose by finding some shape and letting them reflect, presumably if you've got a nice bit of color going on.
Yeah, and I think moving around, but the challenge is not to move too close, because you're just going to end up with your own like tripod holes in the image, or too many footprints. I mean, it's inevitable you're going to get some footprints because there's obviously other people on the beach and people walking around. But yeah, there was loads of these little pools, and I think I took half an hour just looking at different compositions and trying to work out which one worked best, and capturing maybe 5 to 6 different versions of it. And this is probably the one that stood out most, I think, partly because the pool at the bottom slightly mirrors the rock in terms of the point at the top. So there's something about that works quite well for me. And then because all of the sort of fingers of the tidal pools are coming out in the same direction as the clouds, sometimes when you shoot an image there and then, it perhaps doesn't make a huge amount of sense, but when you see it on the laptop or the computer later, you start to piece together, oh, that works because of that. And that can make one image stand out from a collection of sort of 15 to 20 that you've taken from that particular evening.
Yeah, that might be another topic one day, is kind of that self-curation, but we won't go quite into that now. Quick question. Yeah. Brace yourselves, everyone. Quick questions coming from Ralph, and thank you, Ralph, and for the other comments. And again, if you are thinking of any questions, do let us know. Verity's happy to answer anything. Just about whether you use slot in or slide in filters or screw in filters.
I use Lee filters, so I use the slot in ones. Obviously the polarizer is kind of attached to the front, which is useful from that perspective because I can slide all of the filters that I want to use behind it. So
okay, so yeah, there we go. There is your answer on the filters.
But I have screw in the past. I think depending on what you're using and what you want it for, sometimes screw-ins can be just as useful, whatever situation you're shooting in.
Yes, you don't want to screw in police after you, Verity.
No.
And this is, I'm really happy we got this in. This is also Three Cliffs Bay, sunrise. But just, there's something kind of prehistoric which appeals to me about this, and all these gorgeous patterns in the sand. But maybe set the scene, Verity. Sell us on the joy of this morning.
Yeah, this was the last morning I was there, and because of the time of year, it was January, the sunrise wasn't the biggest event of the day because it was coming up over and it was difficult to manage. So it was quite nice when some of the colour came through the sky. And I will fess up that very rarely do I do exposure blends, but this is an exposure blend because it was just too much for one exposure to handle. The light coming over the cliff and the light in the sky and trying to get the foreground in, when my camera was just really struggling with a single exposure, whether I was using filters or not. So it's free images that I've used in Lightroom and just put together so I can manage the exposure that way. So it's funny with me, like I remember the sort of HDR, I hesitate to call it a fad, but that when that was a big thing, I remember the HDR images I created back in like 2008, 2009 were, if I look back at them now, they're just not something I'd put out there. But I think with this, what I was just trying to do was make sure I got enough of the exposure there to bring out some of that drama. So yeah, it's probably one of the only HDR type images I've done in years. But I didn't want to lose that foreground interest, especially the light that's just hitting the side of that little pool just onto the sand. And just how that contrasts with the sky and the moodiness of it and that wonderful bit of rock that sits in the middle of that. And there wasn't anyone on the beach at that point. So other than me and a few other photographers who were there with me, it was completely untouched until sort of everybody started walking their dogs. And I think about 3 minutes after this image, a dog sort of ran through, so it's just dog prints all the way through. So I was kind of glad to get this before it got kind of just a bit more lived in, as it were. Yeah, it's it's a different perspective on the beach again. And I think portrait is only really, I've got landscape versions of it, but portrait's really the only one that works because of how the elements are kind of working together in the frame.
I think there's a lot to like about this, and I'm so happy you mentioned about that light just on the rim there of the pool. And I've popped another poll up for those of you who are watching live and on certain devices. Again, you'll see this asking about your favorite time to photograph. This isn't question time, everybody, but it's just nice little ways to get involved. We've got sunrise during the day and sunset. And I understand as well as anyone that it can depend totally on the situation. But if I can just pick up a couple of quick things on the image, that I love that light. And also you mentioned the rock, but also the fact we just let that pool come around it and that has its little space to breathe, I think is so important. But what, I mean, and this is a really tricky question, Verity, so I'm throwing you under the tricky question bus.
Go on,
then. What, you know, part of the appeal for a lot of us when we're outside shooting is solitude might not be the right word, but we feel like we're reconnecting a little bit with nature. And there's something super special, isn't there, about a sunrise, I find, where it's a new day, it's totally fresh, and that quality of light is something, you know what I mean? It's millions of years worth of evolution going on there. What is it? Why are we so drawn to that?
I think there's, if I'm going to get philosophical about it, which isn't hard to be fair, I think we universally connect with the beginning of something. And yeah, like you said, the kind of the newness, the freshness, this idea of a day beginning, of something starting, and the notion of what's to come, a promise of what's to come. And I think that there's something really, really powerful about that. And there's a stillness. And don't get me wrong, I love sunset, and I love any time of the day now. I think any time of the day can be interesting. But the quiet of watching that happen, of experiencing that happen, of the ethereal nature of the start of the day, I think is really, once you've experienced it a few times, it's really hard not to want to keep experiencing that. Even in the summer, it's, you know, when you have to get up at something ridiculous like 2:45, once you're out there, once you're amongst nature, and once you're hearing those different sounds and experiencing that, it can be very soothing to the soul.
Yeah, soothing to the soul. Very good. We'll run with that. That new dawn, physically, mentally, and spiritually, everything about it, you kind of can start again. So, good answer to a very difficult question, Verity. Sorry. Quick, sunset was the most popular choice there. And sorry, Lynn mentioned she couldn't see the options. I think that's because there were three and you might have to click on it. So sorry, Lynn, that was a bit different to the usual ones. But sunset got 50% of the vote, and then through the day and sunrise was split 25-25. So there we go. The problem with sunset is getting back to your car safely. At least with sunrise, you know once you've got out, you're going to have more light to play with. But
sunrise, you get breakfast afterwards, which is by far the best meal of the day.
Yeah, or the first, at least, if nothing else. Okay, now we've got a fantastic... I love this one. I'm so happy we put this one last. And thank you for everyone who's stayed with us all the way through this. Fantastic. We're going to just spend a few minutes on this, and then I'm going to recap what we've got coming up in the next few weeks, including some new things. But I really love this for lots of reasons. But I want you to tell me the motivation at the time and also after the fact, and when you may have been looking back on it and processing the image and kind of that mood you were really trying to get here.
Yeah, I think sometimes you just want to do something different, and when you're in a place like this, and this was probably in the afternoon, so it's not either end of the day, but you get that kind of really interesting transient light coming through. And yeah, you know, wide angle, big skies, long exposures, I love them. But really zooming into a scene and picking out something and doing something different, that's yeah, I mean, creatively that can be really motivating. So I probably shot this image, shot what was happening with the sea because it was quite rough, over and over and over and over again, just trying to find some kind of pattern in the sea. And I was with a group of landscape photographers, and one of them was Rachel Talabat, who does amazing sea and wave photography, and she was sort of doing a similar thing at the same time. So I was feeling inspired by that as well. And I'm not saying this is anywhere near the level of what she creates, but I think this is the first time I'd done anything like this. It's the first time I've really tried to hone in on the waves and just see things a bit differently. And when I came to processing it, I just wanted to bring out the mood. I wanted to bring out that sense of power that the sea can wield over its, you know, the bay, the sand, the people that are nearby. There's a real elemental power in there that I wanted to convey through this image. And the light had just come out at the right time to capture some of the froth and the spray. And I just wanted to bring that out and sort of darken down the rest of it. It was a difficult image to process. And again, very different from the first image we looked at, like, you know, again, sort of much more to that kind of cooler, moodier end of the spectrum, which just kind of shows what that part of the world has to offer as well.
And that maybe you're even cooler and moodier than you were before. Who knows? But I think
this year.
Yeah, we're all moodier after 2020. But I'll tell you what I thought, Verity, if I can, when I saw it.
Yeah.
My brain, partly because I wonder if I've been exploring and watching a lot of stuff around this, but the first thing I thought of was this was somewhere off in deep space. And it has this sort of interstellar vibe for me, like some nebula star system somewhere with these little stars just dotting off. And I wondered if that had come on your radar, or if I'm just bringing this as a total nutter.
No, you know what, the flecks of water did make me think of constellations, but I hadn't quite made the jump to sort of nebula
deep space.
But yeah, I'm down with that. Yeah, I love that. Well, I'll take it.
one of our viewers, Lynn, up in Scotland, hello Lynn, she said, I like the fact there's no sense of scale to the wave. And I think that let's just pick up on that then as a nice final point. Ambiguity of scale, and it's come up a little bit in our talks over the last few weeks. And by the way, again, thank you everyone for watching and tuning into these. We really love doing them because we love to talk about photography. But ambiguity of scale, be it dealing with something quite large like this or even intimate landscapes, it can be a really nice theme and sort of motif to play with, can't it?
Yeah, I guess it adds the element of fun again, doesn't it? Sort of playing around with an image. And I think maybe the rest of the images that we've looked at have been quite literal. This is what was in front of me in my interpretation of it. Obviously, this is an interpretation of a wave, but yeah, it's a different kind of photography. It's a different kind of creativity, and yeah, I think it isn't that big as a wave, but maybe that's kind of fun that, you know, because of the way I'm shooting it, it's got the impression of being much bigger than it actually is.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, just as a final thought then, before we wrap up, how do you still find yourself, you have to catch yourself and kind of encourage yourself to try and look at things differently? Because we all develop our patterns, we all develop our ways of seeing, but as a creative, you know, we always want to kind of develop that. You can't force it. But are there times when you're out in the field and you kind of check yourself and say, okay, come on, how am I going to shape this up, or how do I feel about this, or what motivates that different view, basically?
I think a lot of it's about getting into the groove. You might start out shooting the stuff that you know, and then for me personally, I find that if I kind of let go of expectation, then I start seeing stuff that maybe I wouldn't have necessarily seen or photographed otherwise. And just this sort of past weekend, I spent probably an hour and a half just photographing different grasses on the sand dunes. And it might not, yeah, I think for me, if I'm enjoying it, if I'm into that space and the kind of the rest of the world zones out, then I'm probably in a good place creatively. Whereas if I'm sort of trying to force a composition, then that's usually a sign that perhaps I should walk away from that and go and look at some, I don't know, patterns in the sand and see what comes of that, and not worry, or put my camera away sometimes and just use my phone and be less expectant of what I'm going to get and more receptive of what I could be photographing.
Yeah, excellent way to put it. Expectation is a difficult thing. Receptiveness, like you say, is the way to be. And that hour and a half you spent looking at the grasses, that's an hour and a half of joy you can't buy.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's worth so much more than the images that come out of it, in a way.
Yeah, the physical act of doing it. So, and everyone out there watching, don't forget that, you know, when you're out with your camera, you are there to enjoy it, you know, especially if it's not having to earn you a living. There's no reason not to enjoy it. And yeah, you have to remove the pressure sometimes and just be open-minded to stuff. But as we rally to a close, I'm just going to give us a quick wrap up of what's coming up next. But first, before I do, Verity, thank you so much for coming on and giving us your time. It's much appreciated.
Not a problem. Sorry that, it was always going to be easy for us to ramble on for seven images. Yeah. We probably could have gone till 10. But
imagine if we had 20 images, we'd be here tomorrow. But Verity doesn't have a boiler that works, so that could be problematic. And if anyone is interested or enticed, more I should say, this tour Verity runs the 23rd to the 25th of September. And so that is on, and there are just, I believe, a couple of 2 or 3 places remaining on that. So do check that on the Light and Land website. A little bit of admin now, just to finish us up for the last moment or two, a little bit of a heads up of what's coming next. I did cover this at the beginning, but for anyone who joined us after, we are continuing with some of our virtual tours, and we're going to be doing 2 of those per month. And we're going to be adding in 2 other things per month. So we're going to keep coming every Tuesday night at 8 p.m. on Facebook, as we have been. Next up is a virtual tour with Adam Karnatz, and he's going to be taking us to a different part of the Lake District that we covered with Joe all those weeks ago when this started. That was a while back now. So Adam's going to be with us next Tuesday, and that'll be a usual hour-long session, digging into some images and some locations. The week after that, Tuesday the 18th of August, I am going to be doing something new for you, which is going to be called Pixel to Print. I'm going to pick an image, which I have actually already picked it, this one here, and I'm going to walk you through a couple of bits around why I shot that, how I did, and then we're going to do the actual raw processing, and we're going to print it. I am going to print it live out of my printer. I saw a comment somewhere asking if the prints were going to come out of your printers. Sadly not. That would cost you a fortune. But it's going to come out of my printer, and I'm going to walk you through the whole process, because we get a lot of questions about printing, especially black and white. and making sure what comes out the printer is what you're seeing on your screen. And I'm going to cover quite a bit of that. And finally, the week after, we'll have Astrid McGee come back to talk to us about Bruges City Tour and York in the UK as well. And Bruges is a fantastic one because architecturally it's fascinating. Plus, there's some lovely landscape, trees and canals and rivers and all sorts of cool things to play with there. So we'll be back. Basically, stay tuned. That's all you really need to know. Don't go anywhere. But for myself and Verity, good evening, goodbye, and I shall speak to you all again very soon.